But if you look carefully, it's pretty clear that the European, particularly the Brits, like the thing that they're producing, as discussed, is manufactured goods. So what they're selling in manufactured goods, lots and lots of raw materials. Okay, lots and lots of raw materials. So that's what they're getting out of the Americas: rice, silk, indigo, tobacco, whale oil, lumber, fur, sugar, molasses, wood. And then they're selling manufactured goods, particularly guns and alcohol. Tragic, I think, really, because that helps speed up the warfare in West Africa. But these folks are trading for manufactured goods as well, and then manufactured goods to some degree that are coming here. So the triangle is principally human beings, slaves that are coming from West Africa and Central Africa, raw materials from the Americas and from Africa flowing northward. So raw materials are flowing into the workshops of England. And this is the Industrial Revolution. It starts in the early 1700s in Britain. They're the first to have the Industrial Revolution. They started. And so they're going to take all these raw materials and make stuff out of it. Okay. Now, again, I told you that Americans wanted more stuff. More. Keep in mind, the British are producing. British can't keep up with demand, interestingly enough. Okay. But the point of it is that the British don't have to make as much stuff anymore. And the Americans don't have any money. They don't have raw material money, like gold and silver money. So they're not able to get things from the British that they would like to get, either because they're not making them or because they simply can't afford them. So then they started looking elsewhere, and they started selling it to the French. And this violates mercantilism. You understand? This goes against the principles of it. And so the British pass a law, the Molasses Act. It's the first law since the Navigation Act to say you can't trade with other people. Now, keep in mind, and this is also important, the British colonies never really questioned the authority of Parliament to pass laws like this. So in other words, they accept that they're part of the British Empire and the British government can pass laws involving who you trade with. Trade partners is like foreign policy. But then they promptly ignored it. So yes, you can pass the law, we're just not going to listen to it. And it's kind of like, if we made a rule here at school and then you just openly defied it and seeing what would happen. Now, they weren't overtly openly, but they would pay off officials or they would smuggle stuff. They would sneak it through a very, very weak monitoring system. All right, now let's talk about life during this period for the ordinary citizen. They did not have roads, so if virtually at all. So if you wanted something that was a good, it arrived by a boat. The big plantations in New England and in Virginia in the South were on rivers like the James River, like the Rappahannock River, and so rivers were how you got around. And this is where, if you look at the cities of colonial America, they were either directly on the coast or on the coast by a river or on a river. Where did you get your information? Where did you go to hang out? Well, the coolest places in town, so to speak, were the tavern. So, for example, this is the Green Dragon. All right, it's a very famous tavern in Boston. And taverns had multiple sort of functions. They were a hotel, so to speak. Usually they'd have like a great room where everybody slept in, and maybe if you were wealthy enough, you could get a private room upstairs. They were sources of alcohol. You could drink there. Usually that's where you got your news from. Like, in other words, the news would be either posted there on a broadboard kind of posting, broadsheet, or somebody would read it to you. They would go here and play dice or cards, gamble. And later, this is where they would gather to organize politically. So if you want to start a political movement like the Sons of Liberty, you do it in a tavern. So the tavern owners were really kind of like the bartenders of the day, like the center of sort of a social gathering, probably more so even than today. So that's where people hung out. Now, they did have churches, but you didn't go to the church for all that other stuff. And then they had a very primitive intercolonial postal system. The postmaster of note, the first postmaster of America, Benjamin Franklin. He's going to show up a lot. He's kind of like everywhere. But they did have a little bit of mail, not much. So they were almost like islands unto themselves, okay? And except for hanging out at the tavern. Now, we're going to start down the subject of religion today in earnest. So religion had been here all along, obviously, from the beginning. But by the 1730s, it is pretty clear that America was a fairly diverse religious society. So keep in mind the word denomination means type of religion, not the broad religion. So All of these 5 denominations are Christian. Everybody understand that? They're all Christian. Now, overwhelmingly, I should say there were a handful of Jewish people in America, and it seems likely that there were Muslim people in America too as a result of slavery. But again, no organized Islamic faith, no organized mosques or anything like that. But there were a handful of Jews, only really in New York City. So that was kind of like the limitation of that movement, that belief system. But the society as a whole was overwhelmingly Protestant. Okay, keep in mind Catholics were considered sort of like problematic because of the situation in England. The Catholic Church had been disrupted in England, and all kinds of issues. But let's talk about each colony. Well, first of all, the Anglican Church pretty much existed everywhere in America because that's the Church of England, But it really didn't exist everywhere. It was only really in a handful of places in substance. In the Deep South, South Carolina was a strong Anglican society, Church of England, C of E, and New York City. So yes, there were Anglican churches. By the way, somebody put that's what the Puritan church was. Guys, even though the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, they were no longer a part of the Church of England in a sense that they didn't formally break away like the separatists, but their church was not called Church of England. It was called Congregational. So you do need to know this term, though, established. Make sure you know what established means. And if you're not, it means taxpayer supported. So there would be a property tax or some other type of tax that everyone had to pay to that church. And so the C of E was one of the 2 established churches. C of E was pretty much, Virginia had the C of E. And then the other established church was the Congregational Church, which if you lived in Massachusetts, if you lived in New Hampshire, if you lived in Connecticut, you paid taxes to the Congregational Church to support its upkeep. Rhode Island did not have the established church. Thank you, Roger Williams, separation of church and state. Now, the Presbyterians were Scots-Irish immigrants, and they were extraordinarily strong Calvinists, just like Congregationalists, but they were also completely independent from everybody else. So these are going to be the same people that are the Regulator movement. These are going to be the Paxton Boys. So fiercely independent, Scots-Irish. Some of them still wear kilts. These are really independent-minded people, and they had no loyalty to either the Church of England or to England. So lots of your revolutionary types are going to grow out of this. And then you had a very small developing church at the time, but it will explode into an enormous church called the Baptist faith. Baptists at the time were challenging the orthodoxy of infant baptism. They said you had to have adult baptism, meaning not a sign of conversion like Calvinism, but to use the language of their church, a born again salvation, a born again revelation. And so they also were fiercely independent. Baptists historically are fiercely independent. They come from Roger Williams initially, although it's in the South where you're going to have the strongest Baptist movement during this period. So these are your earliest churches, okay, particularly the Anglican, Congregational, and Presbyterian. Some Catholics in Maryland, right? Now, the event that changes dramatically life in the Americas in multiple ways is something called the Great Awakening. Now, this is the first of 5 periodic religious revivals in American history. When I say religious revivals, I mean nationwide or on a large scale. So when people talk about America's religious founding, they're not wrong. Early on in the colonial era, I mean, we're not just talking about New England, by the way, but throughout the colonies are going to be a religious revival of massive note. Now, what's interesting to me about this revival is that it not only is religious in nature, it is one of the 2 events that lays the foundation for the American Revolution wholesale, like 2 big events. The Great Awakening itself is going to be a key factor in the American Revolution. So you definitely need to know that, right? Now, first of all, Puritanism had become, well, it hadn't become, it kind of always was, sort of cold and aloof, right? But that was not the only threat to, the Puritan Church. There was another religious belief that had come out of Europe, teachings of Arminius, and it's called Arminianism. Now, this is not the same thing as the country of Armenia. But Arminianism is the belief that there is no such thing as predestination, and it is the doctrine of free will, meaning that you're not selected by God, you choose whether or not you're a Christian. This will influence the Baptist and Methodist faith too. But the idea that you have free will as a Christian or as a person to decide whether or not you will embrace Christianity. So keep in mind, that is a direct controversy to the elect, to Puritans' belief in Calvinism. And so just like any other institution, if you come under criticism, you have two different ways people often respond. Now, the third way being ignore it and hope it goes away. But one is to be defensive, and so like the Catholic Church was defensive during the Reformation and they hunted people down in the Inquisition. The other is to say, well, we need to try to, make some changes to get people to participate more. So, like take me, for example, I've been labeled, academic or nerdy or whatever, and that's a fair description. But I need to try to find a way to connect with you on a personal level, or I lose some of my effectiveness, right? Well, the church had become really boring. You understand? Really cold, really, sleepy, just like some of you guys feel when I'm talking and droning on, right? And so what this movement does is says we want a emotional, spiritual revival. Like, we have become cold as a people. Now, there were two things that you definitely want to take away from this note, particularly. One is that they had a group of ministers who were these revivalists, and so we call them New Lights. The New Lights were pastors who preached a different doctrine, a different belief, okay? And the other is that it led to a whole host of new colleges that at the time are going to be called log cabin colleges, meaning literally founded in a log cabin. Princeton, for example, started out in a log cabin. Now, today we recognize these schools with Harvard and others as the Ivy League. All right, the Ivy League schools, the oldest New England, elite academies. But when Dartmouth and Princeton and Brown were established, they were church, they were seminary. They were there to teach pastors how to be new types of pastors, new light pastors. Okay, so this is a quote, and you know how it is when I give you a quote, it means it'll be on the test. And it said, let's take a look at what undermined traditional authority. So again, when you can't have a revolution without challenging authority, right? Challenging authority. So they mentioned the Enlightenment. Now, you guys hopefully recall what the Enlightenment is. This period of the deism of men like Thomas Paine and John Locke, and the question of the church itself as being a superstitious entity. So they're saying, yes, the Enlightenment, this author is saying, yes, the Enlightenment had some influence, but so did the Great Awakening. So did the Great Awakening. So how did the Great Awakening have an impact? It said it encouraged, unlike the Great Awakening, the Enlightenment. So let's put that in kind of parentheses. The Enlightenment encouraged men and women to look to themselves. So if you think about deism or you think about intellectual philosophy, the key to understanding the world or whatever is within, right? So that's how some people study life in general, by looking to within. But the Great Awakening said, look to God for direct guidance on how to live your lives. Enlightenment focus on what? Rationality, right? So, is it logical? That's kind of my big question. Is it rational? All right. With an interest in politics and government. They didn't really challenge religion, and rather they insisted that you apply rational inquiry. So the idea here is that the Great Awakening is not an intellectual experience. It's not an academic experience. And a lot of what Calvinism and Puritanism was kind of like that, was kind of like head belief, like in my brain, I believe in this. The Great Awakening is in my heart, I believe. So that's a kind of an interesting transformation. You're going from head knowledge to heart knowledge, if you want to use that. Keep in mind, it's interesting to me that who else would you have considered to question this? Basically, who would have said, I don't necessarily think that God is the direct source of revelation. God is not the direct source of revelation. Would have been Ann Hutchinson, for example. So, they're questioning religion and saying, we're going to look rather to ourselves. Okay, the Enlightenment thinkers would have said. Now, keep in mind, if you read this part about heightened interest in politics and government, okay, That is the foundation of a republic or democracy, right? Democratic views. So, in other words, we mostly think of the Enlightenment as a political event, laying out republicanism. Where you teach the public and they become more rational and they make their choices themselves and they have a heightened understanding. And so the Enlightenment, as a rule, was not used to target Christianity, but rather apply to rational thought. This is one of the challenges to the church, to the orthodoxy. But the Great Awakening was about looking to God for how to live your life, but not listening to the traditional authority. Okay, so let's look at what they said. So this is what the Great Awakening looked like. It was enthusiastic. So if you've ever been to a church where people cried and rolled and sang and like had a whole lot of movement, that's enthusiastic religious belief, emotional. And that was the Great Awakening. So you had the fainting bench, and you had people wrestling with Satan, and all kinds of just physical. You would never have seen this in a Calvinist church, at that time in history. I mean, people historically would have been just kind of sitting on their pew, being quiet. Now people are, for lack of a better word, dancing about, throwing their hands up and praising God. Itinerant, that means it means you move around. It means no single base church. So the great pastors, some of the great pastors of the Great Awakening were like mobile. They didn't have their own congregation, but rather they traveled, particularly John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism, and George Whitefield. So, these guys would travel all up. John Wesley and George Whitefield would move about a lot. Again, two different groups. New lights were, the new pastors. Old lights was the old way of doing it. Okay. And it was shared by many. Guys, slaves would go to Great Awakening revivals, indentured servants, wealthy planters, lots of people were there. But here's the thing, that I want you to pick up on. Look at this, guys. Stirred impulse towards independence. Because it says, think for yourself. It says, don't follow the old church religious beliefs, traditional ways, that is. And it was very large. It took place all up and down. So one of the things I hate right now in America is no rock concerts. It's tragic, right? Because when I go to a concert, it's like a shared common experience. Or going to a baseball game. I can't go to of course, my team's doing terrible this year. But nonetheless, I like going where you're around hundreds, if not thousands of tens of thousands of people, racetrack or whatever the thing is that you like to do. But, I went to the first Bonnaroo, okay, and I went to the first Locking Festival. So I can run into somebody and be like, dude, were you at Wrigley Field and saw Pearl Jam 6 years ago? And I'll be like, yeah, I was there, man. So next thing you know, we're like talking about stuff, having a shared common experience. Well, the Great Awakening happened from Georgia to Massachusetts. So it was a shared experience. It was like a Jesus rock concert, right? So all up and down the Eastern Seaboard, people had this shared experience. So it was the first American experience, meaning truly something that happened everywhere. And that meant the regional differences kind of broke down. So as much as it was about religion, it was also about politics. Okay. Now, these are the ministers that I want you to know, particularly these two. So the definite takeaways are Edwards and Whitefield. Okay. So now, Frelinghuysen, there's lots of things in New York and New Jersey named after him. He started it up in New Jersey. You had Gilbert Tennant, who was in Pennsylvania and New York. But the two that you must know, for good, is the great towering intellect, Jonathan Edwards. His sermons were so extraordinary, people wept hearing them. And keep in mind, it wasn't in his delivery, because he had a high squeaky voice and he was nearsighted. So he would give his sermons like this. So it wasn't his art of the presentation. It was the words he was saying were so moving. So Jonathan Edwards, and then the figure who was by far the most effective at communicating to huge numbers of people was this man, George Whitefield. So Edwards was a Calvinist. He was in the Puritan faith. Okay, Whitefield was a Methodist, and so Methodism is one of the new denominations, and that is pronounced Whitfield, even though it's written like Whitefield. And he traveled and would stand on a chopped down stump in the middle of the field and start giving sermons, and people would come all around to hear him. And his voice was so powerful, he could be heard over hundreds of yards, really. People could hear him in what we would think today is like a football stadium. Here in Virginia, you have the rise of Presbyterianism with the emotional. And if you're interested in Southern Baptism, you had the very first Southern Baptist church established in Guilford County, North Carolina, which is Greensboro today. The fellow's name is Shubal Stearns, and he came down here to Guilford County. So lots and lots of pastors, lots more emotional, lots more active. And one of the guys that really gives me a lot of insight into this, which is pretty cool, is Benjamin Franklin. And he does appear to be everywhere at this period in history. He's the guy. So this is what he writes in his autobiography. So he's taking the time to write about Whitefield. In 1739, arrived from Ireland. Now, Whitefield had been preaching in the English Isles. In fact, he'd been all over the British Isles, preaching as an itinerant preacher. That means moving around from town to town. He was at first permitted to preach in some of our churches. Now, keep in mind, Franklin's in Pennsylvania. He's in Philadelphia. But the clergy didn't like him. So they refused in their pulpits. And so he went out into the fields. All right. The multitudes of all sects and denominations attended his sermons were enormous. Now, Franklin is not particularly prone to exaggeration in his writing. He doesn't have to. He's a scientist. He's an intellect. So he's saying it's an enormous crowd. In fact, elsewhere in his journal, he writes that he could walk around the circumference of where Whitefield was, and it was like hundreds of yards away. He could still hear him fairly clearly without any microphone system. There was no such thing. There was no PA system. So this guy was being heard by like thousands of people simultaneously. And he said it was wonderful to see the change made from our inhabitants, meaning Pennsylvania, from being thoughtless about religion. It seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town without hearing psalms sung. So Franklin himself wasn't that religious, but he thought it was really cool that the people were religious. And he said, and by the way, I didn't mention this, and I need to. If you go way back up to this part about people not coming to church, there's a reason why people had kind of stopped coming to church too. Another reason, besides the fact that it was cold, emotionless, a lot of the church, I'd like to add another thing. Also, standard of living was high. Meaning, a lot of times for people, when we become, hopefully you know the word secular, when people become successful economically, they all of a sudden become a little less spiritual, usually. In other words, faith is something that people need when they don't have something else a lot of times, is the expectation. But when you have stuff, you kind of get distracted. So usually the people you find praying the most are the people whose loved ones are sick or who don't have any money or something like that. And what he's saying is people had kind of gotten not very religious. They'd grown thoughtless to it. And that's partially because they'd gotten better off, more well off. And so now he's saying they're more religious again, which is good. Okay. So what does all that have to do with history? Well, it has particularly this part down here, this part of Americans are going to have a pattern of developing where we cycle through sort of not being very religious and then being religious again. But it also broke down barriers between people who wouldn't normally interact with one another. So it was a rejection. Like I said, it was more of a heart. So from then on, religion is going to be a lot more heart-oriented, a lot more emotional. The big two churches of the Baptist and Methodist Church are going to explode in growth after this. Okay, new colleges, the log colleges, all right, and religion is going to be much more of a heart experience. And like I said, there are going to be numerous of these. And I certainly should add an E. I don't know why I missed that here, but let's add an E of broke down regional and class barriers. Create first American. Keep in mind, these folks rarely called themselves American. American would have been a geographic descriptor, like North American colonist. American meaning living in America. American experience. So now you have this shared experience that many, many people took part in. So it's like watching the Super Bowl. You know, if you watch the Super Bowl or Tom Brady's, you know, I don't know if you guys tuned in to watch his resurgence or not, or like thereof. But the point is that if you have a shared experience, then that creates a more sense of identity, common identity. You know, if everybody here goes to a football game together, that's something we all do together. You know, we share together. So a lot more people interacting in a national way. All right, we'll finish tomorrow the chapter and take the quiz on Monday.